So Tricia, if you could go ahead and get that started, please. I have one of my team members, Tricia, is going to be helping with some of the behind the scenes. So she'll be helping with monitoring the chat or putting a few things in the chat as we go along. So we've got a small group. So honestly, if you have a question, certainly feel free to unmute. And we can, just have a dialogue as we go along. I know that at least one of you is actually driving as we speak, so please be safe. But today we're going to talk about student well-being and looking at assessment and best practices. My name is Susan Billy, and I'm the manager of Behavioral Health Support Services here at IU13, and I welcome you today. So for those of you that are at a computer, if you could just take a second and in the chat, just share your name, your role, your district, and something that you're grateful for. While you're working on doing that, I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving along. So those of you that are joining, you can get to meet each other. So this session is part of a series of webinars that IU13 is facilitating to provide just really a responsive, focused professional learning experience that highlights practical and actionable strategies for accelerated learning. The topics and content within this professional learning series were developed as a result of feedback and supports that have been requested by IU13 member districts, some evolving research and data on pandemic recovery, as well as from Department of Education guidance and statewide PAIU network expertise. And for those of you that are new to the accelerated learning idea, accelerated learning has been broken down into 4 components by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. The first component is high quality academics. The purpose of this component is to define the instructional changes needed and foster a culture of data-informed decision-making so that we can ensure every learner has access to the instructional strategies, the materials, and all of the supports that are necessary to really engage with and master grade level content. The second component, supportive learning environments, focuses on just really ensuring that we provide a safe and inclusive space for learning, forming those positive and supportive relationships with our colleagues and with our students and families, and supporting learners and staff to mentally and socially recover. Component 3, healthy systems conditions, focuses on engaging a diverse group of stakeholders within your education community so that they can gain a deeper understanding of the school system and utilize the continuous improvement process. The goal is to use the tools that we need to look at staffing, looking at technology, scheduling, and all of those things that will create a condition so that we can accelerate learning. Component 4 is looking at the system of scaffolded supports. And this component is providing really a continuum of evidence-based academic, behavioral, social, and emotional supports that align with student needs. Today's session is going to focus on the supportive learning environment component, and it will overlap a little bit with the healthy systems conditions component. Today's learning goal is to review strategies and resources for assessing and improving the learning environment in order to mobilize student wellness. We'll focus on assessing student needs as part of an overall framework within that learning environment. Today's session will not be looking at assessment in regards to mental health screening, but that is something that if that is a need for you in your school entity, please let us know and we could look to offer that session at a later time. On the screen, and also it's now in the chat, is the link to a Google Drive so that you can access not only the resources from today's session, but from all of the sessions that have already occurred. And then as future sessions occur, all of those resources will be in the Google Drive. So at this point, I would just like to really get a feel for where you're each coming from. So Trish is going to launch a poll for us. And if you could just take a moment to answer these 3 questions. Okay, well, thank you for taking that time. I just want to show you the results here. So I think we're all feeling the effects of things. Some of you are well versed, some not so much, and some really in the middle. So thank you for taking that time. That's helpful. Schools can increase their capacity to meet the needs of students coping with trauma, which also can include mental health concerns, by looking at a school-wide plan and creating a plan that's going to include all of your staff, as well as your family members of your students and your community stakeholders. In response to the learning loss that's been experienced due to COVID-19, PDE has focused on addressing social, emotional, and wellness of the learners, and looking at what supports can we offer to our school entities. And that's being done through the ARP ESSER funds. So for some of you, you may not be aware that there is funding that's being provided to school districts to support students, to provide professional learning for staff, to provide technical assistance to school districts. There are some really good webinars that have been created. The one that I reflect on this slide, which is available in the resources, really gives a very high overview about PDs guidance. So I would just encourage you to check that out if you are a decision maker for your district. But to kick this work off, PDs developed a decision tree focused on social emotional learning. And the goal of this tree is to help LEAs work through looking at how can we improve the learning environment through social emotional learning and mental health supports. So looking at the first step, looking at setting the direction, and part of that is forming a team and really looking at some big picture things. Then step 2 is assessing social emotional learning and the wellness needs within your school community. So whether that's within one building or hopefully within your whole district. And then looking at how do we plan, and then how do we allocate the resources so that we can meet the needs that we've identified. The guidance is serving to help districts approach this work using evidence-based techniques, so that they can be sustainable, so that they can integrate into the things that you already have in place. Another excellent resource, which I will direct you to, is a previous webinar called Fostering Supportive Learning Environments, and that is available to you through the resources at the end of the PowerPoint. So taking a focus or look at universal wellness practices is going to help really steer our attention to looking at positive relationships, looking at cultural competence, participation and engagement, and physical and mental wellness in the learning environment for both staff and students. So when we think of universal wellness practices, those include, the infusion of safety, collaboration, trust, choice, and empowerment throughout the school-wide systems of support and practices that you have in place. It's also including the establishment of teacher and student connections. And we know that these connections significantly increase engagement, not only in content, but it improves academic outcomes. We also know that students display an increased motivation and confidence in the learning environment when they've made those connections with their teachers and with the school staff. Universal practices create a safe school culture and climate for all students and staff. And so when we think about that, think of maybe the clear routines that you might have, or looking at clearly defined behavioral expectations, whether that's looking school-wide or within classrooms. But also looking at inclusive and equitable supports for all learners. We need to look at a comprehensive system so that we can monitor student well-being, because as educators, we can only support our students if we know what their needs are. And we can do this more effectively if we're utilizing tiered referrals for special services. But what does this mean, and how do we get started doing this? So in order to get started, we really need to set the direction. And to do so, we have to first understand this is not a one-person task. This is not for one of you to embark on and lead the charge within your school entity. A team is necessary so that you can help collaboratively to oversee the equitable, the trauma-informed work, and the planning on behalf of the district. We want to look at establishing a team that has oversight of social emotional wellness. And I know some of you are part of that team that is already in place within your school entity. But it's important that this team has that big picture understanding of what a comprehensive approach to student social emotional wellness entails. And so we want to look at having an existing team that looks at universal practices for all of your students. And we're not here to say, let's start something new. We're here to look at how can we take our existing resources and meet the needs of our students. So this could include people from maybe a school climate team. Maybe you have just kind of a general student support team or a multi-tiered system of support team. Maybe you have PBIS within your district, or perhaps mental health leadership teams, or an intervention team, or a student assistance team. So whatever the team, or maybe it's a sampling from some of those teams that I just mentioned. The idea is to strengthen. We may have to strengthen an existing team so that we can build on creating this learning environment that's going to serve to really coordinate and collaborate across all aspects of our school entity, so that we can establish that starting point. And in order to really get to that starting point, we really need to look at an inventory. We need to look at what are the pieces that are important for our school, we also need to look at what are the resources currently available. Part of that's going to be looking at maybe some gaps that we have within our school, or looking at strategies. And then we're going to be looking at some goal setting and developing some very concrete steps so that we can move forward to try and reach our destination. So once we have a team identified, we need to really look at the role of the team. And first step is looking to develop a regular meeting schedule so that all of our team members can participate. The team's going to look at using some database decision making so that we can align our services then as a result of that data collection. We can't start making decisions until we have some data to look at. This team, whatever you would like to call it, is not the sole decision maker. The team should be fostering partnerships with some of your community stakeholders, with your student population, and with families. The team should also ensure that it's meeting the social emotional needs of all students in a strategic manner. So what does that mean? Well, we can look at it by approaching it. So what are our resources? And then looking at what we have, we can then springboard. Springboarding means we need to start to look at how can we assess our students. We can't put things into place until we know really where our students are, how are they feeling, what are their perceptions. So assessing student needs is going to provide the opportunity for us to prioritize the areas of need. And we want to make sure that we're using consistent language. Part of today is looking at the social emotional learning competencies. And just quickly, these are the essential knowledge and skills, attitudes, and mindsets that we all need to be successful in life. So these are the things that as we talk about SEL, that we need to make sure that we have these in place for students. And it's critical that we ensure that any assessment that we might utilize are part of a larger school strategy for supporting our students. The idea is to eliminate any silos that might currently exist within your school or your school district. Because assessments they can sound scary, but they're a tool. They're a tool for understanding the things that we may not necessarily be able to observe. Things such as mindsets of our students, or maybe some of the circumstances that the students have experienced. Our students have really experienced a lot of hardships that have been as a result of the pandemic, and it's made it very difficult for them to learn in our learning environments. So we need to approach this work from the standpoint of how students' basic needs, such as their well-being, their social systems of support, and their safe learning environment can set the stage for learning. So once you have your team in place, we need to look at our assessment options. And quite honestly, there are a lot of options available to school entities right now. And I'm not here to tell you one is better than another. You're going to need to explore assessment options and select the most appropriate tool for your district's needs. So you will have access through the links to access any of these resources. The CASEL Assessment Guide is what we're going to focus on today. The SHAPE assessment, and then the Ed Instruments website has a lot of excellent resources. So all of these are things for you to really sit and talk with your team about, but really identifying what are your needs and looking at what are our resources so that we can really select the most appropriate tool. So as we dive into CASEL's assessment guide, it's broken down into a couple parts. Part one is going to look at how can we prepare to assess our students. Part two, we're going to look at how do we select an assessment. And then part three is looking at using the assessment data. Part one is broken down into a couple of steps, looking at framing the overall SEL effort, planning the role of the assessment, and then choosing the SEL competencies to assess, because again, this is not a one-size-fits-all for every school entity. But what does this mean, frame the overall SEL effort? Well, it means that we need to establish a systematic approach to implement social emotional learning school-wide or district-wide, whichever applies to you, so that we can meet those identified needs, not what we think the needs are. We need to look at the needs that are really spelled out to us through the data in the assessments. But when we adopt an SEL framework, we're including competencies that emphasize consistent language, guidance on SEL development. We're utilizing resources to support that implementation and, and curriculum and assessment tools. Remember, those SEL competencies are the skills, the knowledge, the attitudes, and the mindsets that our students need to succeed in life after they leave us and move into their post-secondary life. As educators, we develop them through a supportive learning environment, positive interactions with adults and with students, having explicit SEL instruction throughout the course of our school day, and integrating SEL into academic instruction. So when we think of SEL competencies, think of them as we've got the intrapersonal, which are our own thoughts. And then we have the interpersonal, which are the knowledge and the attitudes that we direct towards other people. And then the other aspect of step one is looking at developing a theory of change. And this is important because it helps the district articulate what improvements are anticipated because of the implementation of this SEL framework. So if you think of it as a blueprint that's going to allow your team to really kind of lay it out, look at everything, and look at the end. What do we want to achieve long term? But it's also important to know that just because we've got this blueprint, it doesn't mean that we can't change it as we go along, because we need to always be assessing and we need to be ensuring that we are meeting the needs of our students. And so as we move to step two in planning the role of the assessment, this helps us to look at SEL data from two categories. Formative assessments are for learning, whereas summative assessments are of learning. So it's helpful to think of this as really just different ways of using an assessment. If your school or your district hasn't adopted an SEL framework, then you would want to look to adopt, use a formative assessment so that you can guide your instruction and you can guide your practices within your school or your district. But if you've already adopted an SEL framework, then you want to use a summative assessment so that you can look at, well, what learning has occurred as a result of what we've already put into place. And that allows us to look at the effectiveness of those practices. The next step is looking at choosing which competencies do we assess. So when we're choosing the competencies to assess, and that includes our essential knowledge, our skills, attitudes, and mindsets, it's important that we make sure we're taking a strengths-based approach. So more specifically, make sure that the competencies are going to equip our students with those tools that support healthy development and success. We want to make sure that we identify competencies that are meaningful, that are measurable, and that are flexible. Because remember, I said that we may need to go back and tweak our blueprint a little bit. We also want to make sure that issues of equity have been identified in both the selection of the SEL competencies and the use of measures. It's really important that we do our very best to try and guard against unconscious bias in assessment. This can show up particularly when teachers are the ones evaluating students' abilities or performance. And we'll talk about kind of what that looks like in some of the assessment tools that are available to you. We want to make sure that we're striving to implement age-appropriate frameworks, and that we're articulating how are these competencies going to develop over time. Because if we're starting them with our younger learners, we want to then continue to build on them. And for our older learners, well, we're building on them where they are now, but hopefully we can help them continue to develop them as they reach their last years with us. Making sure that we're looking at those developmental factors is really important, because students may or may not have developed certain abilities. I know you're all seeing that right now. What we would have expected from, you know, our incoming ninth graders, they may not have some of those skills, or our incoming, really even some of our incoming first graders, because we've been faced with a lot of hardship over the last year and a half. So making sure that we're looking at things that are developmentally appropriate for our students to get us started. And it's important to examine the SEL competency data with other kinds of data that we might have. So whether that is school climate data, if you've engaged in that survey, looking at the PAYS, using attendance and academic achievement data. Looking at all of this data together, it allows for us to understand the relationship among all of those different factors. Part 2 of our process, this is where we look to select an assessment. There are 2 steps to this: reviewing the assessment options, then actually selecting the assessment tool. So as we look to review our assessment options, there are several forms of SEL competency assessments. And each of these assessments have advantages and they have limitations. There are 4 types that are available to you in the Castle Assessment Guide. And we're going to walk through each of these: the self-report survey questionnaire and rating scale, the interview protocols, observation protocols and rating scales, and performance-based assessments. And it's going to be up to your team to determine which one of these is best based on the needs of our school. So with each of these, like I said, there are some advantages and limitations. The self-report survey questionnaire and rating scale, this is one that requires the students to rate their own abilities. We're providing this to them. They go through and they answer the questions or respond to the statements. And this type of questionnaire is really useful for collecting information about student awareness, and it's a cost-effective assessment tool to use. There are a few key limitations, and they include there is susceptibility to bias. This type of tool, it requires students to interpret the questions or the statements. So in that regard, this type of tool is not suitable for our pre-K through early elementary students. And this type of tool may not be accessible to all students because of language differences, or maybe because of some required accommodations for students with special needs. So those are things that you would want to make sure that you take into consideration. Interview protocols are a tool that require an interviewer. So that could be maybe a classroom teacher, classroom assistant. It could maybe be a school counselor, but it requires that person to ask questions of each student or make statements to prompt students to discuss each topic point. This is a useful tool for collecting information about student awareness, but because someone is asking the questions, they don't rely on student reading ability, which can be nice. They allow for complex and even in some cases in-depth responses because there is maybe a little bit of a dialogue happening. Issues or themes can be identified through the dialogue that may not otherwise be captured in a questionnaire. Limitations, though, include they can be difficult to administer as well as score because there is a substantial amount of time and resource that's required to conduct them and to code the data that's been collected. They're also susceptible to bias and to faking of the responses. The next type of tool or assessment type is observation protocols and rating scales. This type of tool requires an observer, so again, whether it's a teacher or another school staff member, to evaluate student behaviors using a rating scale or an observation rubric. This type of scale, it can be helpful if we're trying to assess observable behaviors and skills that are demonstrated in the learning environment. They don't rely on students to self-report, so therefore they can be beneficial to use with younger students. The limitations for this type of assessment include, again, that difficulty to administer because there's substantial time required to administer them, to train the person that is going to be administering them, as well as to scoring them and coding the data. This type of assessment is also susceptible to bias. And it's important also to note that the limitations could result from observations that occur from one setting. So specifically, like if we're just doing these observations in a classroom, that can limit the information that we might be looking to gather regarding a student. And this type of scale is also really difficult to gather student awareness. And there is a potential for misinterpreting the source of behavior, again, because it's truly an observation that is occurring. The last type of assessment is a performance-based assessment. These are structured opportunities where our students could be engaging in real-world conditions. It might be a simulated task. And those tasks or those simulations, they're serving as a direct measure of those students' social emotional skills. So it might be students that are out working, on a job crew or something in that regard. They can also, these can take other forms. It might be a discipline embedded project, or maybe there's a game-based simulation that you have available to students. This type of assessment does not rely on subjective judgment, but due to the nature of the assessment, they do require considerable investment in training the individuals that are observing the students in that setting. They also require a good bit of time for administering as well as scoring the assessments. Those are the 4 types of assessments that you'll find in the CASEL assessment guide. Are there any questions at this point before I move forward to show you a few more resources in this assessment guide? Okay, well, hearing none, I'll continue. A really nice feature of CASEL's assessment guide is the assessment catalog. And this is where you can go in and you can select the tool with specificity. The catalog allows you to search and find assessments based on on specific competencies that you might want to measure. Again, going back to what your team has identified as those key competencies that seem to be of concern. It allows you to sort by grade level. It also allows you to sort who's going to be assessing the student. So whether that is a self-report or a teacher or other school staff member. And this catalog, it allows you to go in and view the full profile for each measure, with each measure. And some of the information that you'll be able to see, is there a cost associated with this? What is the administrative and analytic capacity of the assessment tool? It'll provide you information as to whether or not you've got the technological support or human resources to facilitate a particular tool. It's also going to provide you information on the reporting needs. So looking at the level at which the scores are reported. So whether that's student, classroom, whole school, or a particular grade. And then looking at who's going to have access to the reports. Are there resources that are included in the reports? So it allows you as the team to really go in and look at the different features and what is really going to help you meet the needs of your students. Part 3 of the assessment guide focuses on the use of the assessment data. And this is broken down into 2 steps. Step 6 is about implementing the assessment. We're not going to dive into this too much. That is something that if you need some guidance on, feel free to reach out to me. But there is guidance in the guide on how to implement the assessment. I want to make sure that we have some time where we can spend on how you can use the data. So as we think about our data and how are we going to use this, remember, this is going to help us get to our destination, kind of looking at it as our map, that red dot on the map. And the data is going to guide us in the development of an action plan. So we need to be systematic as we think about this process. If we've collected our data, now we can look at creating an action plan. And the data is going to guide us through that plan. But as you're thinking about a plan, I want to encourage you to make sure that you're using the SMARTY acronym and using that for establishment of your goals. So when we think of a SMARTY goal, making sure that it's specific, that it's measurable, it's attainable, relevant, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. Additionally, it's necessary that you make sure that your team, whatever this team is called, becomes familiar with tiered systems of support as part of this action plan. A well-defined multi-tiered system, excuse me, it's the end of the day, I apologize. A well-defined multi-tiered system of support. It includes a few facets. You want to make sure that it's universal, that its evidence-based supports are being utilized so that you can create that positive learning environment and that it's engaging all students in that high quality learning. So you're thinking of that foundation, whatever is necessary for all students, and then we can build on that as the needs intensify. The more intensive evidence-based supports are then going to be provided for our students at a higher level, that have a higher level of need. You might need to utilize some screening as part of this process so that you can determine which students could benefit from some of these additional supports. You also want to make sure, as you're looking at a tiered system of support, that you're engaging in regular progress monitoring, because we need to make sure that our students are responding in the way that we have set out for them to respond. And utilizing this data is going to guide our decision making, whether that means we're going to alter our plan or maybe go into a different direction. But you want to make sure that that is part of your regular practice. As we continue to strive to reach that destination, we want to also make sure that our team's looking to integrate the SEL supports with those supports that we already have in place. Because remember, we're looking at a school-wide social emotional learning approach. The big picture idea is for you to really look at how can this concept of social emotional learning impact your students' mental health. Because if we've got all of these supports in place so that we can address, right, the knowledge, the skills, and the tools that our students need so that they can be successful, then we're going to see an increase or an improvement in our students' mental health. And when we're using a universal lens of really to look at school safety, safe and supportive environments, we're able to do so by making sure we're looking at all students. We're taking that opportunity to enhance the existing systems. Remember, we're not creating something new, we're using our existing systems. Tier 1 supports are based on the needs of all students. And that assessment data that we've collected is going to be the driving force for identifying the needs for some of the higher levels of support. But we need to have that foundation. We need to have this foundation solid before we can look at establishing those higher levels of support. We can't go right to a tier 2 or a tier 3 support without having those supports become overburdened because we didn't have a very solid foundation. And so as we look to use the data to align our efforts, we want to make sure that we're developing a comprehensive plan that's going to focus on that data and that we're addressing the needs that have been identified. So we need to consider a continuum. We've got to have a starting point, and then we've got really, what is our ideal? If we could have our pie in the sky dream. And so we have that continuum of well-being practices that are going to focus on student belonging. And a great starting point is to outline what are our expectations regarding respectful and positive behaviors of both staff and students. But also while we're integrating other things such as conflict resolution and restorative practices. And I know many of you are already utilizing some of those strategies. Those strategies allow for the promotion of a supportive school environment for our staff, for our students, and for the families of our students that might be coming in on a daily basis. So this SEL team, however you define it, we'll want to work with those other tiers. The SEL team doesn't necessarily have to be the team that's at tier 2 and at tier 3, but we should be working together so that we can collaborate and coordinate the efforts, these social emotional learning efforts for all of our students within the building. And we also need to make sure that as we are developing this plan so that we can address student well-being, that we're also providing professional learning for our school staff, because our school staff are the ones that are going to be integrating a lot of this into their regular routine within their classroom. So we want to make sure that they have those opportunities to learn from each other so that they can have interactive opportunities and be able to build their knowledge and their own skills as well as their own resilience as it relates to just an overall well-being approach. So as we consider implementation of these well-being resources, we want to make sure that they're readily available and accessible to all students so that we can meet them where they are, meeting their individual needs. These are the tier 1 supports that create that safe and supportive environment. And this is where our students are going to start to develop that sense of belonging and feeling safe within our learning environment. We also want to make sure that we're integrating well-being, self-care activities, and resources for our staff and our students, because that's going to shift the attitudes and the behavior just really towards a wellness culture within our learning environment. And it's critical that we teach our staff the benefits of a wellness mindset, because it's about them as well. A safe and healthy environment is for all of us, for all of our colleagues, and it's going to help our colleagues thrive in their work as they help our learners be the best learners that they can be. And we also want to make sure that we've got predictable, structured routines. We should have clear, consistent, positive behavioral expectations for our staff and for our students. We want to make sure that we're reviewing those, teaching them, reinforcing them. And we want to make sure that we're modeling appropriate language. We can't expect our students to engage in behaviors if we're not demonstrating and showing them that we too are engaging in those behaviors. And explicit instruction and reinforcement of social emotional skills. Again, going back to that building relationships among each other as colleagues, but building those relationships between our staff and our learners, teaching our learners about conflict resolution and problem solving and just everyday coping skills, things that we all need to have so that we can become really productive citizens as our students age up and move into their post-secondary life. And the last thing that we want to make sure that we have is having a continuum of procedures so that we can encourage positive behaviors. And that's from the top down. That's not just for our classroom staff, that's for all of us within the learning environment. And so as we wrap up our discussion just about student well-being overall, it's just really important that we focus on commonalities that we have with our students, as well as with our colleagues, rather than the differences that we might present with. Because we're people, we're all different, and that's the wonderful thing about being human. And we all bring our strengths and areas of need to school with us every day or to our learning environment. But at the root of it all, we're all human beings, and we like attention from our colleagues and from our students. We like affection from those that we care about, but really above all, happiness. We all want to be happy, and we all deserve happiness. But sometimes, especially now, we've been faced with different circumstances, and our students and our colleagues are coming to school, and they're carrying heavy burdens on their shoulders, and so it can be difficult to really feel compassion. And here I'm talking to you about, let's create an environment where we've got a focus on student well-being. But I'd like to close with just really, sometimes those feelings of compassion seem out of reach. And I'd like to offer an exercise to you, and some of you are familiar with this, but this is an exercise that can help us focus our attention on the person before us, whether that's a student or staff member, or really a friend or a family member. And by using a 5-step exercise, when we're feeling like those feelings of compassion, they just might really seem out of reach. And I'd like to offer these steps to you so that maybe you can change your view of the situation that's before us. So I'd like to ask you to begin by simply bringing someone to mind. Maybe it's someone that you've had a challenging interaction with. Maybe it's one of your a child or a colleague, or maybe a student that you might work with. But picture that person and think about the interaction that you've recently had with that person. And think of these steps. Just like me, this person is seeking happiness in his or her life. Just like me, this person is trying to avoid suffering in his or her life. Just like me, this person has known sadness, loneliness, and despair. Just like me, this person is seeking to fill his or her needs. Just like me, this person is learning about life. And so as we think about looking at student well-being and how can we assess it, we never know what our students are coming to school with, nor do we know what our colleagues are coming to school with. So as we think about looking at our big picture within our school and creating an environment for our students to really feel a sense of belonging and to have a focus of well-being, think of Just Like Me when you're faced with thinking, that maybe there's just no hope. I can't get out of this place. Maybe I'm in a place of judgment. But try to use Just Like Me as a way to focus yourself and offer some compassion to the students and to the colleagues that are there before you. And with those thoughts, hopefully we can use our teams that we have in place in our schools and move us forward to assess our student well-being and to really put supports in place so that we can help our students be the best students that they can be. For additional information, you can visit IU13's Accelerated Learning website. This web address is in the resources that you have been made available to you. As a reminder, Act 48 credits will be awarded to registered participants who have been part of the full live webinar. In order to receive the Act 48 credit, participants do need to also complete the Act 48 evaluation in frontline professional growth. So you'll have links to all of the references from the slides, and some of those references really take you into more and more resources. So today was really just a high-level picture of how you can get started so that you can begin to assess student well-being. There are also several accelerated learning resources available from PDE, and several of those are linked here to this slide. If you have any questions or if I can provide any additional information to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email or by phone. And I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you for joining us. And I am happy to entertain any questions